Thank you guys. Thank you so much, Rami, and thank you so much, Laura. It's
Hello,
I can't say enough about how amazing this cultural Majlis is, and attending in New York, and I really feel that it's created a sense of community in all these different places among Middle Easterners in Toronto or various minority groups, and it's really created a space for alternative conversations. So I'm forever grateful to Sultan and to you guys for organizing this. Okay, I think I'm just gonna go right in. I have the benefit of not having a book, so you're gonna see me stare weirdly at the screen while I read, but I'm just reading my book as a PDF because I still don't have the, very sorry, guys. Okay, so I'm gonna read the 5 poems that happen in the beginning of the novel. For those of you who don't know anything about the premise of the novel, it's about a young immigrant woman in Toronto. She's a hijabi and she's having a lot of struggles with God. She's very lonely, and she spends a lot of time praying for sort of love to come her way. And then she meets this man who happens to be married, and they fall in love, and they have a very, very difficult affair, and she sort of has a crisis of faith. But so I'm going to be reading a couple poems from the beginning, from when they meet and how that kind of unfolds. So this poem is called Beginning Number 2. Toronto. Girls with shaved heads, crop tops, armpit hair 2 inches long, dyed blue. Vision is practice. Kittens that are only exposed to horizontal lines for the first 3 months will see horizontal lines for the rest of their lives. They lose the vertical, will walk repeatedly into chair legs and mistake bowls of blood for bowls of milk. They cannot tell an Iranian's hijab, square silk folded into a triangle, knotted under the chin, from a Bahraini's, sheer black, draped loosely, voluminously, songs pins, the hair beneath held up in a large feathered clip. From a Syrian's, white, 2-piece, slip-on. To be a Toronto hijabi is to be a body every and nobody sees, is to feel sexless and elderly, something disabled, a cable with its head plugged out of the wall. Men, even Muslim men who are younger than you, with beards 2 fists in length, will ask permission to curse in your presence. They ask permission from other people, stopping mid-sentence to say, "She cool?" Shifting on their sit bones, as though God himself did not have ears, only a single tin can copper wire descending straight from his brain to your tongue. As though you weren't salting the parquet with your face 5 times a day, ha ha, as though you were heard. Bargaining. If I wear this thing that you told me to wear, 14 centuries before I was born, in a desert, tethered to the island where I was born, if I wear this thing that you told me to wear, and it hides my fuckability, i.e. femininity, i.e. desirability, i.e. existential relevance vis-a-vis other people, I walk into the room and the room walks out. But if I agree anyway to be theoretical, if I agree to be fanatical, to be symbol, to be spectacle and spectatorial, not woman with heart, but garishly colored inanimate object, standing lamp or wheelchair. Hello, hello, please, hi. My name is extraneous, extramarital, extra virgin olive oil, pressed against the window panes of lovers' rosy, hell-lit houses. Can I come in? If no good comes from you, if all good comes from you and no good is beyond your handspan, if you are the giver and I am the given, if you feed the hungry, if you clothe the naked, if you heal the sick and shelter the orphans, if I am low, tired of carrying on my back every single thing I own, including you, if I am grateful, patient, keep pointer fingers in my pocket, keep salting the parquet, waiting for you to come through, if I wear the thing you told me to wear, do all the good things you told me to do, will you cure my loneliness? Meeting. Number 2. There are meetings. Example, Nof and Khadija exchange names plus geographies, Manama plus Khobar, in Psi 100. Hence they are considered to know each other. And there are recognizings. Example, Khadija and Khadija meet, but one of them is bearded, calls himself Muhammad. We say the same thing at the same time. We say the same thing at the same time. We say the same thing. Like double loops in a single circuit, every neuron fires twice. In English, the collective noun for miracle is spook, i.e., a school of fish, and a spook, miracles. Nof, how can I show you my joy? Mama says the first time I tasted chocolate at the age of 2, I burst into applause. In that synaptic gap between knowing what we know and knowing that we know, he and I jumped up and down like children. We found each other, we found each other. He said that a man said that, the prophet man said, our Lord laughs at the despair that his servants feel when his help is so near. So near, he laughs. I cannot breathe for gratitude, alhamdulillah. I can't breathe either, alhamdulillah. I had forgotten me. I too thought he had forgotten me. In English, the collective noun for wonder is faith, i.e., a flock of birds and a faith of wonders. Ending. And he says this word, wife. He says it in a sentence that includes other words like Istanbul, Rome, comfortably, 2 children, mine. But this word wife inhales all of the air. Its tall black gills open laterally, revealing, tucked in their slits, the jealous red muscle. This word wife inhales the air of the world. Behind him, sparrows drop from the sky like turds, and my lungs close wetly. The organ walls designed never to meet and cannot unstick themselves. I have 2 wrung sheets writhing from 2 adjacent ribs. Behind him, leaves petrify on birches. My blood is fast bluing and blacking, the word most commonly used in the Quran to describe a tragedy or calamity, she wife, is musibah. From the root asaba, meaning to hit a target, or correctly hit a target, meaning there is no finger fumbling, unluckiness, why me, why now, like this. A javelin hurtles through the ages, with your name inscribed in its hollow wooden sole, plus the time of impact, plus the exact decibel of pain. Listen, that your lungs have closed wetly is no surprise. You have 2 prenatal bats, writhing in amniotic sacs, and all the fish have risen to the surface of the sea. Grieving. The sun did not rise in my room for 40 days. Nof, who knew nothing, came and went with boxes of soup, Portuguese pastries. She fed me in my bed. She washed the sheets and swept the parquet. She ran baths, and while I soaked in them, she sat on the toilet reading me Kundera in Eastern European accent, so I would not drown or eat the bath salts. Nof combed my hair, she braided it, flaxseed oil. Nof emailed all my professors, including Man with Egg, to say someone in my world had died. My phone began to ping ping. If you hold your grief up to the light and there is a hole in the velvet, even a very small one, you will have a star with which to orient yourself. If there is no hole in the velvet, not even a very small one, the night will flood inside your skull. Your brain will float outside of time, like a deity, or the eels decking their own mothers on the ocean floor. A body lay on a bed in a room. I was not inside the body on the bed or in the room. After 40 days, when the sun finally rose, I rose with it. I entered the kitchen to discover Nof had taken all the knives. There were no razors in the bathroom, no belts in my closet. Weeks later, my papers were due and I learned she had removed even the staples from my stapler. I think that's all I'm going to read. Those were 5 poems. One of them I skipped a couple lines because I got lost, but yeah. I think that's all I'm going to read. Thank you for listening. I had just moved to Alexandria, to this apartment, which is my grandmother's apartment. And I had just finished a novel that I'd been working on for 5 years, and couldn't get anyone to read it or be interested. And I was really depressed for multiple reasons. I mean, I moved here and I didn't have friends or community. I couldn't find work, and I was living with my grandmother, and I didn't know anyone. And I also didn't really have access to a lot of books because it's so difficult to get literature in Egypt. So I was reading a lot of poetry and feeling kind of frustrated with fiction. And so I started writing this hybrid, which is very close to the kind of work I've always wanted to do, but I find that when you call something fiction, editors tend to constrict you into a sort of, it's very sort of formulaic, and all of the weirdness of your work and your writing tends to get edited out. So in a way, this novel was kind of a response to that. If I could have called this project a novel, just fiction, I would have, but I wouldn't have been able to sell it. So sort of starting off thinking about it as a hybrid or as poetry, and because I was so frustrated with the fiction I was writing that I couldn't sell or get anyone interested in, I think that's how it came about. I was just very angry with that.
Who did you have in mind when you were writing the poetry?
Well, I think I've mentioned this before, but I was really naive when I was writing it, and I wasn't thinking about audience at all. I think partially because I was having so much trouble getting my first book read. I didn't think that there would be any chance. I wasn't thinking ahead. Only actually when I started editing that I had to think about how the book would be received, and I had to kind of go back and read through the lens of someone who isn't an Arab or isn't a Muslim, and sort of negotiate how the relationship, the character's relationship to Islam and to God is resonating to outside ears, and trying to kind of compare that to how it would sound to somebody who is Muslim or is from this community. So all of that kind of like double vision happened later. I was really oblivious actually when I was writing, and was just sort of writing the kind of stuff that I enjoy for myself. Yeah. I would really love to see people. I just want to say, like, I would really love for you guys to ask your questions so I can see you as opposed to writing. But obviously, if you're shy and you want to type, that's okay.
Thank you, Noor, for this amazing reading. It was very, very touching. I would love to ask you, have there been any new sources of inspirations in your life, especially since you moved back or you moved to Alexandria?
Yeah, so many. I think it was only after moving here and working on sort of the next project, that I realized how, you know, I always thought about this book as The Wash's Praise as an Arab story. And it was only after coming here that I realized actually it's not an Arab story. It's a story of the Arab in diaspora, and it's a very Toronto story actually. It's an immigrant story, and I was sort of discovering this as I was trying to explain to my friends here the premise. They would say, "Well, you've written this book. What's it about?" And I would say, "What? Well, it's about this hijabi woman, and she's very religious, but she's also having an affair, and so she's in a crisis." And I kept getting the response from people being like, "Where's the crisis? Like, what's the problem? So she's having an affair and she wears hijab, what's the issue?" And I kept getting this response until I realized, oh, right, this is a crisis if you're in diaspora, and so much of your identity becomes distilled in these superficial markers of identity. Whereas here in Egypt, the relationship to faith and to God and to sex and to love is so much more willing to encompass contradictions, and it's just much more fluid and dynamic. And I've been sort of realizing all the ways in which that story is a diasporic story. And so the one I'm writing now is I feel much more kind of Egyptian in the questions that it's juggling around with, I hope.
And diaspora, your work still touched me somehow. But you know, we've all been students at one point and lonely, and that's universal. But what affected me was the similarity to Elizabeth Smart's By Grand Central Station. I sat down and wept. I don't know if you've read it.
Mm-mm.
Oh, okay. This was written about 50 years ago, and it's although a bit autobiographical. So it's a novel in poetry, although she draws from the Bible rather from the Quran. On her story. But anyway, I just wanted to share that with you and congratulate you.
So much. Thank you so much, Luciana. I'll definitely check it out. It's been on my radar, but just one of those books that floats on the radar for years and takes a while to get a hold of.
Thanks.
Thank you.
How did your community respond to the book?
Well, you guys are my community, so maybe you can tell me. I'm here. I'm in Alexandria. I haven't seen any copies of the book because I'm here and they haven't reached me yet. And so I don't really know how people are responding. I mean, I've only gotten responses from my individual friends, but I was kind of waiting on a moment like this to be like, hey guys, how are you feeling?
It's Percent, not Antic.
Percent!
Sorry, I didn't realize I was using my work Zoom. First of all, I'm so elated to see you. That's like number one. And your reading is it's just amazing to hear it in your voice as opposed to me reading it alone in my apartment. But I have two questions and you can kind of take or leave whichever ones. But I wanted to ask about, obviously the main love interest here is the affair. But I want to hear more about Noof and the relationship between the protagonist and Noof, because I'm just thinking of how it's just like so embalmed in love, like the way that she cares for her. And secondly, you know, based on your walrus talk, Muslims can be mistresses too, or I know I'm not getting the title right. How do you kind of, you know, do the conversation in your head about how much to write and any kind of sensitivities to be wary of or not? Like how much does that weigh on you of how, you know, certain people or communities may respond to this and the kind of defensiveness that may come with that?
Thank you so much, Tessa. So good to see you also. Well, so with regards to your first question, I think there are multiple kind of lines of love that can be drawn in the book. I mean, there's the relationship between Kuku and the man she falls in love with. There's also the love between her and her best friend. There's the love between her and her father, which becomes kind of transmuted a little bit into a love with God. And so, and the lover becomes almost a substitute God because she's at such a stage of despair. And so, I mean, it's going in many directions, but arguably the most lasting of the relationships is hers with Noof, which it isn't shaken by any of these sort of ups and downs. You know, she's the one that kind of takes care of her, and she's the one that's there in the end, you know, from the beginning right until the end. She's the one that she tells the story to, so she's also the kind of holder of the grief and of the pain and of the love. So yeah, I think as Luciana was saying, there's so much of, you know, being that age where you're at university and your mind's being opened up to different things and you're going through a lot of experiences for the first time. And somehow in diaspora, all of that becomes heightened a little bit. And if you don't have sort of solid female companions to get you through it, I just don't think you'd survive. So this was kind of an ode to female friendship at that age. But as for your second question, like I said, I was really naive when I was writing it and I wasn't thinking about all these questions. And it was only afterwards as I started to try to put into words what this book is about that I started running into problems and became really wary, because there is such a scarcity of representation for Muslim authors that you're always running the risk of people saying, oh, well, this is Islam and these are Muslims, and people kind of reading it in the wrong way and getting excited about it for the wrong reasons. So after the Walrus talk, I had many people coming up to me and being like, oh, wonderful. Isn't it so great that Muslims are now taking back their sexuality? And yes, why shouldn't a Muslim girl go out and have an affair? And I was like, that's not actually what the book is about at all. Not the purpose of this novel at all. It's not about sort of female sexual liberation, you know, an Arab woman's like unveiling. It's not about that. It's just about you know, a character who's three-dimensional and having a real relationship with God and struggling with it, and what that looks like from the inside. Because I find that when we get characters of faith, and maybe Tendi can talk to this because this is kind of her forte, my friend Tendasai, but very often when you get characters of faith, you know, you rarely ever get writers who are truly respecting their relationship with God and their struggle, and not kind of looking down or looking from the outside in with a kind of you know, smirking kind of eye. And maybe I'm thinking a bit more of sort of Arab literature versus diasporic literature. You don't have quite the same stakes. You can have these kind of more complex characters, but I don't know. So I was really just trying to create a character that looked like me and my friends, and had the kinds of conversations that you and I have had, for example, and that so many of us have been having about what it means to be in this place that's not home, trying to kind of hold on to certain tenets of your faith, and then being challenged with so much confusion and internal contradiction. Yeah.
Hi, I just have a question about, well, could you talk a little bit about how you started like writing, or what sparked your interest, like your story with writing in general?
Sure. Well, I had when I was in high school, I didn't have many friends. This is kind of a theme in my life. I keep sort of moving to different places and losing all my friends and having to start over. But when I was in high school in Dubai, I didn't have friends, and I had one friend, one or two, but one who was a couple years older than me, and I was sort of desperate to impress her, and she told me that I was a writer, even though I hadn't really written much, and I was forced to become one because I so desperately wanted her approval. She was 5 years older than me, and extremely, extremely intelligent, and she was a writer herself, and so really she created a writer out of me just by telling me that that's what I was. So I owe her my entire craft. I don't even think she knows that I haven't been in touch with her for years. But yeah.
Oh.
Hi, Noor. Thanks again for coming to give the talk. Honestly, I did read a bit of your book, but hearing it from you kind of definitely gave it a few layers of depth. I did want to ask, out of all the labels that you could usually find out of, like, I don't know, Canadian Egyptian or whatever it may be, why is it that you chose to self-describe as Alexandrian specifically?
That's a good question. I think it's the one place that's been sort of the most constant in my life, despite the fact that I've lived in other places for a lot longer. But I was born in the States. I lived there for 7 years, and then Dubai for 11 years, and then Toronto for 6 years, and then here. But throughout all of those years, it was the one place that I would return to every year, and my grandmother's house and my extended family. I don't know, it's probably the closest thing I have to a root, and Alexandrian versus Cairene or Egyptian, because the culture here is so distinct. And I know that Alexandrians love to say that, and they love to tell you, I'm Alexandrian, I'm not from Cairo, blah, blah, blah. But it really is distinct. The relationship to food, the relationship to nostalgia, the kind of nostalgia that is choking this entire city, what we used to be, you know, back when we were multicultural and we were so rich and we were so clean and we were so beautiful and we were the jewel of the Middle East, and this kind of thing. I mean, I think that there's so much of what I think of as Egyptian is actually just Alexandrian, and so it made the most sense to kind of hang on to that when I didn't quite know where I was or what I was doing. And now that I'm here, I feel a bit more comfortable using it permanently.
I feel you on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Noor.
Hi, Asha.
This is great.
Hey.
That was really beautiful. I haven't started reading yet, but I'm kind of glad that I got to experience it for the first time in your voice. which is how I like to experience your writing. So I guess this question kind of carries off the last one, in the sense like you pick to identify with a municipal identity, and it makes a lot of sense to me as a Toronto person. And I'm very interested in the writing of that city and in the writing of cities in general, because I do think that Toronto is a strangely underwritten city in some ways. So maybe you could speak to a bit of what your kind of process was or thoughts were around writing that city.
Toronto.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so good to see you, Asha. I just want to like sneak that in. I'm very happy. It's been a while. Yeah, Toronto. I don't know. I have a kind of because I've been moving around so much, I tend to not write about the places that I'm currently living, but write about them after I've left. And so I was writing this story here in Alexandria, but I had just come from Toronto and didn't have an existence really here. And so I was thinking a lot about what it meant to be an Egyptian, but then be sort of living my most formative years really in a place like Toronto, where so many people just kind of show up. And it is very much a diasporic city and an immigrant city, and it's got this, it does have its own sort of identity complex that's, I think, unique from the larger Canadian anxiety with regards to what is our Canadian identity when we're so close to this big American black hole. But I feel that Toronto, or maybe I don't know, there's some people here who can probably speak better to this, maybe Bob McGill or maybe Yasser, who are more familiar with writing from different parts of Canada. But I really did feel that there's something unique about the kinds of identity crises that happen in a place like Toronto, where you have so much, you almost don't really have a dominant culture. You have so much people rubbing up against each other from different places. So you have a lot of Caribbean influence, and you have a lot of Somali influence and Arab influence, and West African influence, and it's mixing together. And especially at the high school level and at the university level, people are figuring out who they are together in this weird mix of other people also figuring it out together. And so there's a lot more anxiety and also a lot more forgiveness in that relationship. I've never really felt in Toronto that I was outnumbered as an immigrant, which is, I think, a weird thing to say for a North American city. You do feel that in other parts of Canada and other parts of the States, but Toronto has something unique in that everybody feels the same kind of, what am I doing here? But everybody else doesn't know, so we're all in it together. Yeah.
Thank you, that was beautiful.
Thank you, Asha.
Hey Noor, it's Filza here, by the way.
Filza, hey!
I'm sorry. Hey! Yeah, so it's so lovely to see you read them. I've read the poems, some of the poems posted elsewhere, but like seeing you reading them is a whole different experience, and thank you for that. My question is actually kind of similar to Asha's question, but I just wanted to ask you the writing process of, so you said that this novel came about as when you moved back to Alexandria, you started writing it in Alexandria. So how was that process? It's almost like you're writing this Toronto experience, right? It's right while being in the city, or while you're living in the city. So how do you feel like it gives kind of a different perspective that you would not have had, had you been, writing it while you were in Toronto?
It's very possible. I don't know why I've got this pattern of writing about cities that I'm no longer in, and it could be just nostalgia. Thing. Oh, you too.
Yeah. It's been 5 years for me, and I'm still writing about Toronto. I'm like, why?
I think it takes time. I think that in order to kind of, those first few years in a place, you're still sort of getting steeped in it, and you haven't yet figured it out really, or yeah, I think it just sort of takes, maybe there's like a certain number of years. Maybe if I had stayed in Toronto, I would have written it at the same time. I just needed to kind of I needed the ideas to percolate and the kind of culture of the city to seep in. So it's very possible that it was just a timing thing. But also this project in particular happened in an unusual way, which is usually I'm very slow and the process is really laborious and it takes years. This project, I don't know what happened, but it just kind of, I wrote the first poem and then I wrote every poem afterwards, and it was more or less done very quickly, which yeah, I'm still figuring out why that happened and hoping that one day it will replicate again, because it's unusual. But yeah.
All right, thank you for that.
Thank you, Filza.
Hi, Noor. That was beautiful, and thank you so much for sharing. I was really inspired by all of your poems. I'm curious, and I know you talked a little bit about, kind of that confidence that, made you identify as a writer, but as you were actually writing the book, what did that process look like, and what does that creative process look like for you?
Thank you. That's nice to hear your voice. Well, I mean, like I was just saying, this project really was unique in that it just came out very quickly. It started with Kuku's voice, and I think usually for me it starts with voices. All of the projects that I've worked on, yeah, all of them actually without exception have been written in two voices. So I've got a bit of a yeah, I've fallen into a little bit of a pattern early on. But once I had Kuku's voice and once I understood it, it just kind of led the way and I could follow it. And so usually my experience of writing is more so I'm following along and trying to figure out where my characters are going. But with this project in particular, even more so, it was really almost I was getting dragged, which I know sounds, I know how it sounds, because writing is so often a solitary endeavor and grueling and difficult and lonely, and it doesn't usually happen quite so quickly. And I'm really wary of narratives of inspiration. This whole, I was struck with inspiration and in like a fit of frenzy, I like busted out the next. I don't think that's how it works ever at all. I think it's really problematic. But this one, I did kind of just get lucky with it. But I didn't get lucky with others. So I just want to say, nobody give me the evil eye. We're all in this together.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I think so often that's what people think is, it just like, especially in this like quarantine period, you just sit down and something pops out. So I appreciate the work that you put into it, and it's really beautiful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it never happens that way. Never, ever.
Hi, Noor. Yeah, so I'm very grateful that I got to hear you actually say these poems, because I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. My question is, I guess, somewhat related to things people have brought up earlier, but specifically about your identity. I guess when I saw your background, when I heard about this event, I felt in a way I related to it a lot, just based on the places that you lived in and grew up. I personally, my parents are Syrian and Lebanese. I was born in Australia. I grew up in Dubai, and now I'm studying here in Philadelphia. And I'm just curious to see how your experiences in the places that you've lived in, grew up in, were born in, affect your perspective on and relationship with your identity, given the particularities of each of those places. I think like the thing Dubai stood out to me a lot, because I think that's a very unique place in a lot of ways, just as being an Arab in a Western country is. So, and now going back to Alexandria, I guess, back to the motherland when you've been out of it, I guess all your life, just the impact that's had on your relationship with your identity.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to meet somebody else who's got a similar kind of constellation. And I think a surprising number of, at least the people that I know that are here, also have similar trajectories of kind of bouncing around. Yeah, I think that one of the advantages that we have as, if you want to call us third culture kids or Gulfy kids, people who've passed through the Gulf as a stepping stone very often from the third world to the first world. I think that one of the advantages that we have is that we, unlike the kind of classic diasporic model, which is a sort of bifurcated identity of, oh, I'm, you know, Egyptian Canadian, or I'm whatever, like Lebanese British, or whatever the dichotomy is. We're not really, we don't have that split identity. We have a much more complicated, nebulous relationship to different places, which makes us sort of outsiders everywhere, but also gives us access to different cultures in a way that I think it would be hard to, it gives us the ability to kind of see a culture from different vantage points, is what I'm trying to say, as opposed to just constantly comparing West versus East, or, you know, some sort of simplistic version of that, by looking at kind of multiple cities in different parts of, let's say, the Arab world or South Asia or whatever, East Asia, and comparing that to different cities in the West. You're really able to, it no longer becomes this kind of two-dimensional tug of war, and it becomes much more a kind of, you're able to sort of enter spaces and very quickly get absorbed in them. Like, I don't know about you, but I'm mistaken for a local everywhere I go, and that kind of makes you, it just gives you access to different cultures in a way that, if you're born in one place, or if you're stuck between two places.
Salam, Noor. It was just so lovely to read this book and to hear you read those your poems at the beginning. It was like a book that I just inhaled at one go, and I was struck. There were so many amazing like one-lines that speak to the complexity of Muslim characters. There was a line about, in her purse there's halal, soy sauce, and condoms in the same spot in her purse, and I just I loved that line. And what struck me about this book, and I want to ask you about, is the book has so many references either to ayahs or to poems or to other things that a Muslim reader would either be super familiar with, or maybe would be experiencing for the first time. And your book struck me as different from other things I've read, where you didn't do like a lot of exposition of, this is Islam, this is what the character is experiencing. It was just, the reader will catch up. And so how much, like, what kind of conversation did you have with yourself about, like, how much can I trust the reader? They will figure it out. I want to challenge the non-Muslim reader and the Muslim reader, and just what that process was of not doing the, let me tell you about the 5 pillars of Islam so that you can access this book. Yeah.
So good to see you, Shagufta. Thank you for your questions. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Yeah, I mean, with regards to I was a bit worried afterwards while editing and sort of starting to think about the presentation of the book, how people will read these kinds of contradictions. But while writing them, I think I just really genuinely wasn't thinking about audience in a stupid way. Like, this is not me being like, oh, I just write for myself. No, I wasn't doing the kind of calculations that I think probably you should be doing, at least at the editing stage, which I did start to do then. But yeah, initially I wasn't thinking that I need to kind of, how will this read to a non-Muslim audience? What do they need to know to understand? I was sort of so steeped in the psychology of this character, which is very similar to my own. I mean, I also am a practicing Muslim, and so, you know, these are all the kinds of, these sort of religious rulings or ayahs or hadith were part of my, I mean, and they are part of my world. It comes up in casual conversation when you're talking to friends and you're stressed out about, can I tweeze my eyebrows or not? And is this okay? And can I do this while I'm fasting or that while I'm fasting? And sort of seeing Muslim girls who are my friends in Toronto dealing with, you know, having their faith come up against these sort of barricades and weird obstacles, and thinking about, do I need to be worried about if the soy sauce is halal? Do I need to worry about, can I make out when I'm fasting or after I'm fasting? You know, weird sort of problems that it's very difficult to get religious counseling on, because you can't go to a sheikh and say, I'm having these problems, these specific problems, but you can go to your friends. And so at least the community that I was part of, the group that I had, was full of people working out these problems together. And it was very much like a sisterhood of counsel. And so so that sort of made its way in, and that was, if there was an audience, probably that was the audience. It was just me and my friends. But I don't think I was even that aware while writing it. It sort of came later that I panicked and went back and had to sort of read it and think, what will people think, and is this offensive? Would a Muslim read this and get offended at the idea of the halal soy sauce with the condoms? You could, and it would be a valid reaction, and I can understand why that would be a valid reaction. So
thank you for, it just felt like a maturity to like the stories we are now telling and writing that I felt so delighted has now arrived, that you can have stories with flawed characters, and we're not, the whole weight of the religion is not on this book. And thank you for making it and putting it out in the world.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy.
Hi, Noor.
Hey, Shireen.
Hi. I also inhaled your book in one go. It still resonates with me. Actually, I think about it, I would say every few days I think about it. And I'm really curious as to what Kuku and Noof showed you about God.
That's such a cool question. Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think that they have very different relationships, and part of what makes me comfortable with Kuku's relationship being depicted in this way in English, presented to readers who are coming from different backgrounds and might already come to the book with a lot of Islamophobia or whatever, is that I think it's counterbalanced really nicely with Noof, because their relationships to God and to Islam are so different. I mean, Kuku starts off with a very transactional relationship with God. I mean, she's constantly begging for love and constantly feeling, well, I do this for you and then you do this for me, and if you don't do this for me, then you're failing me in some way. And so she's dealing with the rejection of God and the rejection of her father, or at least she perceives it in that way. Whereas Noof has a much more delightful, mystical relationship with God, which is, rather than please, it's thank you. And she's sort of moving through the world, seeing evidence of God's miracles everywhere. And it's just this really, I mean, I would hope to think that one day I could move through the world like Noof. I don't think that I do. I don't think that I move through the world like either of them. But it was kind of useful to think about what, if you could distill your conversation with God to kind of one phrase or one word, what are you actually saying? Are you asking or are you thanking? So that's kind of what I was thinking about, because I think that I used to be an asker, and I'm trying to transition more into a grateful being, but you know, it's a struggle. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Hi, thanks Lara for hosting this. This is very cool. And Noor, thank you for being here. I just wanted to, as one note, I logged in and heard that you had moved back in with your grandmother in Alexandria, and I had done a similar, that was my desk work, like way to get back to the homeland, and that is a very unique experience. So all the moments you felt, like very real, very valid, very special. So thank you for writing from that place and sharing that with us. If I could speak to your poetry, I had a question on that. I think having lived in Dubai, you have a very interesting perspective on the nuances of the different Gulf countries, more than one who might just be from Alexandria would. And I just wanted to know if you could speak to that special romance friendship that you have between Bahrain and Khobar, in that moment when you talked about the two women. I've experienced that myself, but also Bahrain doesn't get a lot of traction in writings, and so it's very cool to see that. My family's in Bahrain. So I just was wondering if you could speak to that and your decision to include that, because it's such a niche thing that one couldn't approach it, you know, so your inclusion has been kind of personal. And thank you for your work and for being here today.
Thank you so much for your question. It's always nice to, I don't know if you're in the Gulf right now, but it's nice to kind of yeah, have people from the Gulf
I left
reading the book. And
a month before Corona, and I wish I hadn't. So.
Oh, you left. Okay. Well, yeah, I think there's several people here that are Gulfy kids. But yeah, the Gulf, the first novel that I wrote was entirely about the Gulf, and I'm hoping that one day I'll return and sort of write more about it, just because there is so little that is written about the experience of third culture kids moving through the Gulf or living in the Gulf. It's such a unique experience, and it's also a new experience. I mean, migration to the Gulf countries is, most of the Gulf countries are, I mean, we're talking 50 years old, like really, really young. And so it's really with our generation and maybe a little bit older that this whole experience became possible, that, you know, the oil boom and migration from other Arab countries and other sort of South Asian and East Asian countries began. And so you've got this whole generation that are being raised in this really weird, I mean, I know we were talking about Toronto being multicultural, but the Gulf is a whole other ballgame, because people are literally showing up and moving through very quickly. People aren't staying for very long, or even if they are staying for very long, there isn't a way for them to get properly sort of absorbed in the culture because of the restrictions on citizenship and things like that. So you've got this really unique space of it reminds me, or I often think of it as an airport terminal, because people are just, there's so much traffic coming in and out, and you're rubbing up against all these different cultures in a way that is really unique. And so I'm not really sure why Kuku and Noof ended up being Gulfy kids, except that was my experience, and that's what I could sort of speak to. I don't actually know what it's like to have lived in one place your entire life and then moved to Toronto, but I know what it's like to have kind of hopped around and then from the Gulf gone to Toronto, and it sort of, you know, I'm not sure where you moved to, but one of the weird things about living in the Gulf is that when you move anywhere, you don't really experience culture shock, and that's something that people are surprised by. So I didn't have to kind of spend a lot of time talking about Kuku and Noof's relationship to Toronto, how weirded out they are by things, because they're not, because I'm not. Probably you weren't when you moved wherever you moved. There's something about being in the Gulf where you're kind of surrounded by so much culture and in this weird nebulous space that you can be plopped anywhere else and again just be absorbed in that space and not suffer the kind of extreme shocks that sort of a typical immigrant would. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but or if that is your experience, but that was mine anyway.
No, if I'm allowed just one reply, I just want to say thank you.
Yeah.
If you can find time when you continue to write to share more stories about the Gulf, I think you have it down perfectly. And it's just so refreshing to hear someone talking from that perspective. I'm not a writer, so I'm just grateful for your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I promise I will never write anything about a camel. No camel.
Hey.
Sandy!
Hey, Noor.
Hi, guys!
Where is Noor? She's in a place called East in Alexandria. Okay, I'll try to get through this question. So Noor, I'm just so happy to be here. I've only managed to read about half of the book, but I had a question about the emotions that you had for each character as you were writing them. And what I mean is that when I write a character that I decided that I loved, it's hard for me to make them incredibly flawed. Like I can make them flawed, but I can't make them just extremely disgraceful or and if I hate a character, it's much more easier for me to be cruel to them, and it's harder for me to be fair and kind and nuanced. Could you tell me how you feel about each of the characters? The professor. He's not. No, sorry. Yes. All of them. All three of them. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tendi. It's so good to see you and the whole fam. Yeah, I don't know. I think when it comes to the characters in the book, I really don't know. I think I have a hard time being cruel to my characters. I mean, I think that writers have different, you can tell sort of a lot about people's relationships to themselves and to the people around them, their family members and their community and their friends, by how they treat their characters. Personally, I have a really hard time making bad things happen to them. And so sort of one of the central questions that I was really struggling with when I was reading this is, you know, once the story began, I knew, okay, I've got Kuku, and she's in love with this man, and she's doing something that I think most people would agree is wrong. You know, she's having an affair. She shouldn't be having an affair. The man has a wife. The man has kids. It's against her faith. And but so then, where do you go from there? How do you carry that story? I was really struggling with, you know, do you punish her? How do you write a story like this that is not punishing her, but also not, I mean, I just found ethically I was at a loss, because I felt that people might potentially be reading this story, and I don't know, if you've got kind of a, thinking about sort of the ethical ramifications of this narrative, I don't know. I was really struggling, and I'm struggling still to kind of find a balanced way to talk about who she is as a person. And my biggest sort of hope in writing this is that you would be sucked into her perspective enough and dragged along with it, that you would also sort of be that woman who is having an affair and making these choices. And I wanted to kind of create a constellation of circumstances that are difficult enough. And I tried to spend as much time as I could before he appears, the professor appears, to kind of set up the circumstances so that you can see why somebody would make a decision like that in those circumstances. So it's really easy, I think, and this is maybe a trend in at least my Muslim community, or at least my family and the larger Muslim family that I'm a part of, the way that we talk about ethics is very often there's good people and there's bad people, and you make a choice. And there's very little understanding for circumstance and for there's very little feeling that anyone is a step away from being Kuku. So that's kind of what I was trying to do, was just show you actually how close it is, and how if you are in the right corner and that's your only way out, that anyone would take it and anyone would react in the same way. And so I didn't want to kind of be punishing her, but I also didn't know how to deal with her. So I was trying to be as kind as possible. I don't know, this is a very difficult question to answer, and I'm not sure that I've done a very good job, but I will keep thinking about it. Maybe you guys can help. Maybe if somebody has thoughts or ideas. I don't know, I'm kind of at a loss.
Anas was asking, how did your conversation with God change following the courses with Laurie Silvers?
So Laurie is this convert lady in Toronto. She taught Intro to Islam courses when I was in U of T, and she taught a lot of religion courses sort of at the intersection of Islam and gender. And prior to taking her courses, I had a particular relationship with Islam and with God, which is, it was sort of ahistorical. I don't really know how else to describe it, but the way that I was taught to think about what Islam is that Islam is this thing that has sort of come down to us, and it has always looked in this same exact way. And if you go to any country, it is practiced in the exact same way, and that this is how it descended on the Prophet. And so for the last 1400 years, we have been praying in the same way. And that's just completely not true. And it part of what Laurie's courses gave me is they gave me a lot of sort of historical, cultural, political context to understand why certain rulings were made at the times they were made, what the 7th century Arabia looked like, and how those specifics shaped how we practice today, how that has changed over time. how the sort of religious rulings that I thought were set in stone were actually really, really culturally contingent. So we spent a lot of time looking at how Sharia has changed over time, and sort of what religious schools of thought or madhahib became popular and which ones didn't, and why they became popular, and it had a lot to do with politics and money and very little to do with sort of a divine connection to God. And so, you know, maybe this sounds really obvious to all of you now. It definitely does, but as an 18-year-old at U of T, it was really sort of mind-blowing, and it really humanized the early Muslim community for me, and in a funny way sort of humanized God. So yeah, so really changed my relationship with him. I'm not sure, yeah.
Sorry, I feel bad because I could just also ask this to Noor later, but I wanted to talk about what happens to Kuku in the end and sort of throughout. I feel like it makes me sad, but it's also quite relatable how unstrong she is, like how weak she is, and how she keeps blending into these other things around her. Like she blends into Muhammad, and she like then eventually is blending into this like what seems to be this like very animalistic, like, you know, strange, non-human thing that she becomes in the end when, like, I don't know, when I was reading it, sorry, spoilers, but when I was reading it, I was like, I sort of like imagined like a rabies type episode, like sort of that like insanity and like foaming at the mouth and things like that. And I wanted to like, I don't know, I want to hear you talk more about it.
Thanks, Maria. Good to hear your voice. Yeah, I think I'm not sure why she turns into a dog, but she does turn into a dog. Sorry, spoiler alert, but the whole second half is kind of about her sort of devolving from human into animal, which was the closest thing I could come to kind of showing where her relationship with this man, like what it was doing to her spiritually. I think that it's inevitable for many reasons that have very little to do with religion, that if you are in a situation like this, that it's going to have a negative effect on you as a woman. I think that this was kind of how I was working out how to punish her or not punish her, or what that means, what that looks like, is that I don't think you need to be, I don't think you have to read it as kind of divine reprimand. It's more so if you're in a relationship with someone and you are being made to feel that you are subservient, or that you are sort of under their real relationship with their real wife and their real family, and you are being dismissed in this way, and you are being sort of resorted to only for pleasure, that it is inevitably going to hurt you. And that has nothing to do with God being a punisher. It has more to do with you hurting yourself by making a choice that maybe you actually couldn't choose otherwise, but it's not good. It's not good for you. So I'm not exactly sure why a dog or why an animal, but except that maybe, no, I don't know. Maria, maybe you know.
It's good. We can think about it.
Okay.
All right. Hi. Thank you so much for your book, Noor, and for talking to us today. I just finished reading it and I loved it so much, and really, like, I don't know, I feel like I've been looking for something like this that really, like you were saying in the beginning, like actually takes the character's faith seriously, instead of it just being, you know, either like the narrator is looking down on that, or it's sort of flatly righteous about faith. So thank you for that. And I wanted to ask you about the form of the book, and like two things that really stood out to me. First of all is your use of parentheses, which I really loved, and I feel like kind of challenges this linearity of writing, and like we have to move from one idea to the next, and you kind of often will like nest many parentheses inside each other to like keep digging at and say like, wait, no, for you to understand this one thought, you have to understand this, which to understand that, you have to understand this. So I loved that. And then also it's the way it's broken up kind of in Kuku sections in these like prose paragraphs, but then without punctuation and kind of these spaces that aren't always spaced, you know, sentence by sentence, but rather like, for me, it kind of made me, you know, I can read this part of a sentence fragment and then there's a space and then the thought continues. So now I can read like this part of it on its own, but then I read this and then I go back and read that again with this new understanding. So I felt like it really made me slow down and think about different units of meaning. And yeah, so that's kind of what the forum did for me as a reader. I was curious how you came to that form of writing and why. And yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think all of your observations are, this is sort of what I was hoping for, but I can never tell how things are going to read to somebody outside my brain. But yeah, I think that with Kuku's voice, she is so young, she's so teenage and excited and passionate and a little bit hysterical, a little bit melodramatic, but comes with the age. And so I needed a way to kind of speed up the lines, but also find ways to slow them down or break them. And so that's kind of where having these blocks of text, I mean, usually when you have a block of text, like a prose poem versus a regular poem, you're forced to kind of keep going because you don't have these clear stops. But then also having, you know, putting the spaces between where you would logically have a pause means that you have to kind of speed up in order to get to the next thought. And that's, I think, part of the reason that people were saying that it's like a quick read. It's quick because on a technical level, you don't have a place to stop. You have to kind of keep going, or if you do stop, it's oftentimes you're stopping sort of, but the next word would be so close on the page anyway that it's tempting to kind of go on. So I think that the form came out of the sort of age of Kuku and her character, and her, I mean, I think if she was just sort of narrating something ordinary and she was going about her life, I wouldn't need to make her so hysterical, but she's having a breakdown and she's turning into a dog and she's in love with someone and she's losing God. And so I was trying to kind of drag you along as much as possible and implicate you as much as possible. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I hope so.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, Noor. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
I have a question about, have you ever considered writing in Arabic? And also the imaginary audience in this case, if yes, would you address them with the same approach you had for the English readers?
Okay, so yes, it is a very famous, very incredible Arab author, Egyptian author, so I should say, and he writes in Arabic, so I'm just letting everyone know. Yeah. Frankly, my Arabic isn't good enough at this stage. I mean, I'm fine with spoken Arabic and I can read Arabic novels, but the language itself, I feel, would take me so much work. I mean, I would have to sort of stop and dedicate the next 10 years to reading as much Arabic as I could, and then maybe I could give it a shot. But I don't know. I mean, I know my limitations, and I have a bit too much respect for Arabic literature to sort of make a fool of myself trying to write something when I just know my command of the language is not there yet. But that being said, of course, it would be a very different book. You know, like I was saying earlier, this work only really works in English, and it works in Toronto, and it's an immigrant story, and it's a story for somebody who is thinking about these issues in English. It's not actually really an Arab story. And so if this was happening if the setting was in Alexandria, it would look very different. I mean, the affair would be completely different. The relationship, the crisis would look,
No, I mean, if the study was still in Toronto, but in Arabic, and the imaginary audience is Arab readers.
Well, I guess that would open up I guess it would open up a different host of questions, because if the readers are reading in Arabic, then presumably most of them are here as opposed to there. And so you would have, there's certain things that you can't assume people would know, you know, and there's certain relationships to what the Toronto experience is like, you know, when you're here and people talk about, oh, Fulen, so-and-so has immigrated to Canada or whatever. There's a very different understanding of what that looks like. And so, I don't know, it would be a different set of questions, I suppose. Well, how did you, you know, maybe I should ask you, I'm sorry, I know we're out of time, but maybe I should ask you, as somebody who does read and write in Arabic as well as English, what was your experience as an Arab in Canada hearing me read this in English? Did you feel I was speaking to you, or did you feel?
Well, I felt that there's a lot of cultural signs and cultural keys that addressed mainly to a foreign reader for this culture.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, I think this is definitely an immigrant story and a Toronto story.
Yeah, this is an Alexandrian story too. By the meaning of it, Alexandria was, in the beginning of the 20th century, Alexandria was a really cosmopolitan place, and people from different cultures and ethnicities in Alexandria were communicating together in French.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think that Gulfi kids you were talking about, somehow they're Alexandrian by the old meaning, and but there's also maybe two kinds of Gulfi kids. I've seen a lot of Gulfi Arabophone kids and even writers, famous writers now in Egypt and the Arab world, like Ahmed Naji, who's exiled now in America, is a Gulfi kid too. But he's from this side of Gulfi kids who were in the traditional side of the Gulf, or the Arabic, a very Arabic and very, let's say, Wahhabi side of the Gulf, not the cosmopolitan Dubai, Doha, Manama style, you know. So, do you have anything to add to this point of the Gulfi kids and the differences between types of Gulfi kids?
Well, I think definitely it depends on where you are. You know, there are certain hubs. The experience in Dubai might be very similar to the experience, or well, Dubai is a little bit unique, but maybe, you know, going to Manama looks to me very much like Sharjah looked 10 years ago or something like that. So there's, I mean, I don't want to kind of paint this really simplistic idea of like a progression from sort of old Arabic to like new modernist whatever, but I do feel that the cities all have very similar, they have a kind of similar route, and it can go in different directions, but you can sort of see how there's something uniquely that there's something that really does connect all of these places. If you go to Qatar, you could plop me anywhere in the Gulf and I would know I was in the Gulf, which is a weird thing to say because they are so different in different ways, and they're modernizing in different ways and heading in different directions. They have different demographics. But you're right in pointing out that there are differences. The experience in Khobar is so different from the experience in Riyadh, so different from the experience in Mecca. I mean, each city has its own sort of levels of conservatism, different kind of ethnic populations, different kinds of immigrants that come in and for different reasons. So all of that is definitely affecting the landscape. So so for sure there are people like Ahmed Naji who have a different experience. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yasser.
Hey Noor, what's up?
Hey Kirk.
What's going on? This has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much. You know, it's great to hear you to read this again. I had a question. So, I mean, there's a lot of humor in the story. And I found as I'm going through it, there's like a lot of things that you're doing that are just really clever, right? Ways of referring to things or, you know, calling back to things in the story. And I wanted to know, like, how much of that was just, you know, the way you like to tell a story, and how much of it was conscious in how you wanted us to understand Kuku and what she's, you know, what she moves through.
Thanks so much for your question, Kirk. Kirk was also indispensable when I was writing this story and editing it. So thank you. Yeah, I don't think, it's a good question. People have been asking me about the humor. I'm not actually a funny person, and I don't talk like that, and I don't make people laugh. So it's, I think, just a weird function of getting inside somebody else's head and speaking with someone else's voice, kind of like a ventriloquist, that you can be funnier than you are or be smarter than you actually are. I think that's just one of the weird, it's just a weird quirk of writing, but I wasn't trying to be funny, and if I tried to be funny, I would fail horribly. So I think it just kind of, this is the voice that she came in, and this is her character, and it's her wit, and I got to kind of steal some of it and write it down, but it was not intentional. And if you found it funny, it's like through no fault of my own. It just, I'm very sorry, and also happy that you found it funny. Thank you, Lara. Thank you, Rami. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, Noor. That was lovely.
Thanks, guys.